a man at the peak of success, gazing out over a city aglow with lights, yet feeling a chill deeper than the snowstorm raging outside. He has it all: wealth, power, fame. But one day, a shadow from his past emerges, holding a baby, staring at him with eyes that hold no blame. Will he turn away again, or risk his entire empire to reclaim what he's lost? This story will tug at your heartstrings and make you rethink family, honor, and what truly matters. If you're dying to know what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment. Henry Caldwell stood alone in his glass-walled office, 60 floors above Manhattan, a king surveying his frost-bitten kingdom. Snowflakes danced beyond the window, catching the glow of a city that never slept. But inside, the silence was deafening. At 60, he was the chairman of Caldwell Enterprises, a titan of the energy industry whose name adorned headlines and skyscrapers alike. Tonight, a sleek silver plaque sat on his desk, engraved with Entrepreneur of the Year, its edges glinting under the soft light of a designer lamp. He'd accepted it hours ago at a gala, amid champagne flutes and hollow applause. But now, as he traced a finger over its cold surface, a familiar ache gnawed at his chest. Success, he thought, tasted like ash. The view was breathtaking. Towers of steel and light piercing the winter sky, but it offered no warmth. Henry's tailored suit, crisp and black as midnight, clung to his broad shoulders, a uniform of power that felt more like armor. He pressed a hand against the glass, the chill seeping into his palm, and let his mind drift. 20 years ago, he'd walked away from Clara. 18 months of marriage, a fleeting chapter he'd closed with the precision of a business deal gone sour. She'd been soft-spoken, her hands calloused from a life he'd never understood, her laughter a melody he'd once craved. But his partners, those silver-haired vultures in boardrooms, had sneered. "She's too plain, Henry. Too small town for a man like you." He'd listened. He'd chosen ambition over her, signing the divorce papers with the same steady hand he used for billion-dollar contracts. Now the memory of her lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. "Mr. Caldwell?" The voice jolted him back. His assistant, Marissa, stood at the door, her tablet glowing in the dimness. "The PR team's ready for tomorrow's shoot at the Brooklyn shelter. It's a good look. Tycoon with a heart, you know." Her tone was brisk, polished, the kind of efficiency Henry demanded. He nodded, barely glancing at her. "Fine. Make it quick." She hesitated, then added, "They're expecting snow. Might delay things." He waved her off. "Doesn't matter. Just get it done." Marissa vanished, leaving him alone again with the hum of the city below. A shelter. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire on energy, powering homes, cities, lives. Yet, here he was, orchestrating a photo op to prove he cared. It was a calculated move, a nod to the press that loved a redemption arc. Henry adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light, and muttered to himself, "She doesn't belong there." Who she was, he couldn't say. Not yet. But the words slipped out, unbidden, a whisper from a past he'd buried beneath. Boardroom victories. The drive to Brooklyn was a blur of snow-dusted streets and honking horns. His driver navigated the chaos with practiced ease, the black SUV cutting through the storm like a blade. Henry sat in the back, staring at his reflection in the tinted window. Gray hair neatly combed, jaw still sharp, eyes hollowed by years of sleepless ambition. The shelter loomed ahead, a squat brick building dwarfed by the city's grandeur, its windows flickering with faint light. A handful of volunteers milled outside, their coats dusted white, and a cameraman adjusted his eye lens. Henry stepped out, the cold biting his face, and straightened his overcoat. "Let's make this fast," he said to Marissa, who'd appeared at his side with a clipboard. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and stale coffee. Folding tables lined the walls, stacked with blankets and canned goods, while a murmur of voices filled the space, low, weary, human. Henry scanned the room, his posture rigid, a man out of place. He was here to pose, to smile for the lens, to leave. Then he saw her. Clara stood near the back, cradling a newborn in her arms. Her hair, once a cascade of chestnut waves, was streaked with silver, pulled into a loose bun. Her coat was worn, its hem frayed, but her face, God, her face, held the same quiet strength he'd once known. The baby squirmed, a tiny fist escaping its blanket, and she hushed it with a tenderness that pierced him. Her eyes, deep and steady, met his across the room, and for a moment, time unraveled. 20 years dissolved, and he was back in their cramped apartment, her voice calling him to dinner, her touch softening the edges of his restless soul. He didn't move, couldn't. His throat tightened, a knot he couldn't swallow. The camera flashed somewhere to his left, but he barely registered it. Clara's gaze held no warmth, only a flicker of recognition, sharp and unyielding. She shifted the baby, turning slightly, as if to shield it from him. Henry's hands clenched at his sides, the weight of his solitude crashing down like the snow outside. "Henry?" Marissa's voice cut through, tentative. "We're ready for the shot." He didn't answer. His mind raced, piecing together the impossible. Clara here in a place like this? With a child? The questions clawed at him, but he kept his face composed, a mask honed by decades of control. He took a step forward, then stopped, the distance between them vast and unbridgeable. "What are you doing here, Henry?" Clara's voice was low, edged with frost. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. He opened his mouth, the words catching like gravel. The company. A donation." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Filming, you mean?" The accusation stung, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. Not here. Not now. The baby whimpered, and Clara rocked it gently, her focus shifting. Henry watched, rooted to the spot, a man who'd conquered boardrooms but felt powerless now. "She doesn't belong here," he thought again, the words a quiet ache in his chest. But who was he to say that? He'd walked away, chosen the glittering heights over her steady ground, and yet, seeing her, strong, unbroken, holding life in her arms, something shifted inside him, a crack in the armor he'd worn too long. The camera flashed again, and Marissa tugged at his sleeve. "Sir, we should go." Henry nodded, but his eyes lingered on Clara. She didn't look back. As he turned to leave, the snow swirled harder outside, a white veil over the city he'd mastered. But inside, a storm of his own was brewing, one he couldn't outrun. The shelter's air hung heavy, a mix of damp wood and faint desperation, pierced only by the crackle of an old iron stove in the corner. Henry Caldwell stood frozen, his polished shoes out of place on the scuffed linoleum floor, his breath shallow as he watched Clara. She sat on a folding chair near the stove, its faint glow casting shadows across her face, lines etched deeper than he remembered, but still hers, still the woman he'd once vowed to stand beside. In her arms the baby nestled closer, its tiny head cradled against her chest. She dabbed at a smear of milk on its chin with the edge of her sleeve, her movements steady, practiced, a quiet act of care that felt like a rebuke to his presence. He shouldn't be here. Not in this place. Not in her world. The thought gnawed at him, but his legs wouldn't move. The cameraman had packed up, Marissa hovering somewhere behind him, her clipboard a shield against the awkwardness. But Henry stayed, rooted by something he couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or the ghost of a life he'd discarded. He cleared his throat, a sound too loud in the murmur of the room, and took a step forward. "Clara," he said, his voice low, steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "I didn't know you were here." She didn't look up right away. Her fingers brushed the baby's cheek, soothing its soft fussing, and when she finally raised her eyes, they were cold, unyielding. "You don't need to know," she said, each word deliberate, a wall he couldn't climb. The rebuke stung, sharper than he'd expected, but he kept his face composed, a mask forged in boardrooms and battles. He'd faced down tycoons and hostile takeovers without blinking. He wouldn't falter now, not under her gaze. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, hands clasped behind his back, a gesture of control. "The company, it's a donation run. I wasn't expecting. He trailed off, the excuse sounding hollow even to him. Clara's lips tightened, and she shifted the baby, its blanket slipping to reveal a tiny fist. You weren't expecting me, she finished for him. I get it, Henry. You're here to play the hero for the cameras. Well, we don't need saving. Her words cut deeper than any boardroom insult, but he swallowed the urge to snap back. He wasn't that man. Not tonight. Instead, he took another step, closing the gap just enough to see the faint tremble in her hands, the exhaustion she hid so well. Who's the child? He asked, his tone softer, a crack in his armor he couldn't mend. Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering with something, pain, defiance, memory. She adjusted the baby, pulling the blanket tighter, and when she spoke, her voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. This is my grandson, Emily's son. The name hit him like a punch, a name he didn't know, a piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized was missing. Emily? He echoed, the word foreign on his tongue. She nodded, slow and deliberate. Our daughter, Henry, born after you left. She died 6 months ago, cancer. Fought it alone. Raised him alone until she couldn't anymore. The air left his lungs, a silent theft he couldn't stop. A daughter. His daughter. Dead. The weight of it pressed against his ribs, a truth he hadn't prepared for, couldn't fathom. His mind raced back. 20 years, countless deals, endless nights, and nowhere in that tapestry of triumph was Emily. He'd never known, never asked. Why didn't you tell me? His voice broke, just a fraction, but he steadied it. Hands, tightening behind him. Clara's gaze didn't waver. I tried, she said, her tone flat, final. Letters, calls. You were too busy building your empire. I stopped when I realized you didn't want to hear. The accusation hung between them, heavy as the snow piling outside, and Henry felt it settle into his bones. He'd walked away, yes, but he'd never imagined this. A child, a life, a loss he'd had no part in. I didn't know, he said, quieter now, the words a plea he hadn't meant to make. Clara's eyes softened, just for a moment, then hardened again. You didn't want to, she replied. Emily grew up without you. I made sure she had enough, love at least. And now this little one. She trailed off, looking down at the baby, her grandson, their grandson, and the tenderness in her face was a mirror to his emptiness. He wanted to argue, to defend the choices he'd made, the pressure from partners, the demands of a world that didn't forgive weakness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, a man who'd mastered negotiation reduced to silence by a woman with nothing left to lose. I can help, he said finally, his voice firm, a lifeline he clung to. You don't have to do this alone. Clara laughed, a sound sharp and brittle, like glass cracking underfoot. Help, she said, her eyes flashing. You think you can waltz in here with your checkbook and fix 20 years? You don't even know what help means, Henry. The baby stirred, a soft whimper breaking the tension, and she rocked it gently, her focus shifting away from him. Dismissed. He felt it, the sting of irrelevance, but he didn't lash out. He couldn't, not when she was right. The room seemed to close in, the murmur of voices and clatter of tin cans fading to a dull hum. Henry's chest tightened, a storm of regret and disbelief churning inside, but he kept his posture straight, his face calm. I'm sorry, he said, the words unfamiliar, heavy on his tongue. For what it's worth. It's not, Clara replied, not looking up. Not to Emily. Not to me. She turned slightly, her shoulder a barrier, and the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Henry stood there a moment longer, watching the firelight flicker across her silhouette, the baby's tiny breaths a rhythm he'd never known. Then he turned, his steps measured, deliberate as he walked back into the snow. Outside, the cold bit harder, the wind howling through Brooklyn's narrow streets. Marissa waited by the SUV, her breath visible in the air. Everything okay, sir? She asked, tentative. He nodded, curt, and climbed inside, the door shutting with a thud that echoed in his skull. As the car pulled away, he stared at the shelter shrinking in the rear view, Clara's words looping in his mind. "You don't even know what help means." For the first time in decades, Henry Caldwell felt small, not powerless, not yet, but small. And that, he knew, was only the beginning. Henry Caldwell drove away from the Brooklyn shelter, but the weight of Clara's words clung to him like the snow on his overcoat. The SUV glided through Manhattan's glittering streets, a silent cocoon of leather and steel. Yet inside, his mind churned. "Our daughter Henry, born after you left, died 6 months ago." The sentences looped, relentless, each one a hammer against the fortress he'd built around his life. He stared at his hands, steady, unscarred, the hands of a man who'd signed deals worth billions, and wondered how they'd failed to hold something as fragile, as vital, as a family. Back at his Hamptons estate, the silence was louder than the city. The house sprawled across acres of manicured lawn, its windows dark against the night, a monument to his success that felt more like a mausoleum. He shed his coat, letting it fall onto a leather chair, and poured a glass of scotch from a crystal decanter. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it didn't dull the ache. On the mahogany desk in his study, a stack of files waited. Contracts, projections, the lifeblood of Caldwell Enterprises. But his eyes drifted to a locked drawer, one he hadn't opened in years. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unlocked it, the key cold against his fingers. Inside lay a single folder, its edges yellowed, the word divorce scrawled in his lawyer's precise hand. He flipped it open, and there it was, the agreement that had severed him from Clara 20 years ago. Her signature, small and neat, sat beside his own, bold, unflinching, a mark of the man he'd been. Tucked beneath it was a memo from his old partner, Richard Hensley, dated weeks before the split. "Henry, she's a liability. The board won't take you seriously with a wife who can't play the part. Cut her loose, or we walk." Richard's voice echoed in his memory, smooth and insistent, a serpent in a three-piece suit. Henry had listened, convinced that power demanded sacrifice. Now, staring at the paper, he felt the first stirrings of something bitter, shame perhaps, or the ghost of a dignity he'd traded away. He downed the scotch and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Paul," he said when the line picked up, his voice clipped, controlled. "It's Henry Caldwell. I need you to dig into something quietly." Paul Grayson, a private investigator with a knack for discretion, had served Henry through hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. "Name?" Paul asked, his tone all business. "Emily," Henry replied, the word catching in his throat. "Last name unknown. Daughter of Clara Caldwell, died 6 months ago. I need everything, where she lived, what she did, anything you can find." The next morning, Paul arrived at the estate, snow dusting his trench coat. He carried a thin manila envelope, his gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're not gonna like this," he said, sliding it across the desk. Henry opened it, his pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside. Photos spilled out. Emily at 25, her chestnut hair like Clara's, her smile bright against a backdrop of a modest apartment. A resume listed her as a social worker in Queens, her education cobbled together through night classes and grit. Then, a death certificate. Emily Jane Caldwell, 28, succumbed to pancreatic cancer. No next of kin listed beyond Clara. "She was yours," Paul said, leaning back in his chair. "No doubt about it. Born 9 months after your divorce. Clara never remarried, never even dated from what I can tell. Raised the kid on her own. Waitress jobs, then a clerk gig at a nonprofit. Emily followed her into that world. Helping. People. Tough kid. Smart." Henry's fingers tightened on the photos, but his face remained a mask. "And the boy?" he asked, voice low. "Her son," Paul confirmed. 6 months old. No father listed. Clara's got him now." Paul hesitated, then pulled a folded letter from his coat. "This is the kicker," he said, handing it over. "Found it in the company archives. Your old assistant filed it away, marked it as spam. Henry unfolded it, the paper creased but legible. Emily's handwriting, young and unsteady, dated 5 years ago. Mr. Caldwell, I'm your daughter. I don't want money or anything. I just thought you should know I exist. I work at a shelter in Queens. Maybe you'll see me there someday. Emily. A phone number followed, long since disconnected. Henry's chest constricted. A silent ache. He couldn't name. She'd reached out, he'd never known. Why didn't I see this? He asked, his tone even, though his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly. Paul shrugged. Your assistant back then, Karen? She filtered anything personal. Said you didn't want distractions. It's been sitting in a box ever since. Henry nodded, slow, methodical, burying the surge of regret beneath years of discipline. He'd built walls, yes, but he hadn't realized how high, how impenetrable they'd become. That afternoon, he drove back to the shelter, a bag of groceries in the passenger seat. Bread, milk, diapers, things he'd guessed might matter. The snow had thickened, blanketing Brooklyn in a hush, and the shelter's lights glowed faintly through the storm. Inside, Clara was at the same table, sorting blankets with a quiet focus. The baby slept in a makeshift crib nearby, a tiny bundle, against the cold. Henry approached, setting the bag down gently. I brought these, he said, his voice calm, measured. For the boy. Clara glanced at the bag, then at him, her eyes narrowing. I don't need your pity, Henry, she said, her tone sharp but steady. We've managed without you for 20 years. We'll keep managing. The rejection landed like a blow, but he didn't flinch. It's not pity, he replied, meeting her gaze. It's a start. She held his stare, searching for something. Weakness, maybe, or deceit, but found neither. Then she turned back to the blankets, dismissing him without a word. He didn't push. He couldn't. Not yet. As he walked back to the car, the letter burned in his pocket, Emily's voice whispering through the years. Maybe you'll see me there someday. He hadn't. She was gone, but her son wasn't, and neither was Clara. Henry slid into the driver's seat, the engine humming to life, and stared at the shelter through the snow-streaked windshield. For the first time in decades, he felt the stirrings of a fight. Not for power, not for profit, but for something he couldn't yet name. Dignity, perhaps, or a chance to prove he was more than the man who'd walked away. Henry Caldwell returned to the Brooklyn shelter the next evening, the snow still falling in thick, silent waves. The groceries he'd left yesterday sat untouched in the back of his SUV, a quiet reminder of Clara's rejection. He carried no bags this time, just himself, stripped of the props he'd once thought could bridge the chasm between them. The shelter's door creaked as he stepped inside, the air warm with the scent of burnt coffee and damp wool. Volunteers moved with purpose, their voices a low hum, but Henry's focus narrowed to one figure. Clara, seated near the stove, her hands working a pair of knitting needles. She didn't look up as he approached, her fingers deftly looping yarn into the beginnings of a tiny sweater. Blue, soft, the kind of thing a grandmother might make for a child against the winter's bite. The baby slept in a crib beside her, its breath a faint rhythm in the stillness. Henry stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling across her work, and watched, the needles click in a steady dance. The sight stirred something deep, a memory he'd buried beneath years of boardroom victories. Clara knitting in their old apartment, her laughter filling the space as she'd held up a scarf she'd made. For him, he still had it, tucked away in a drawer at the Hamptons estate, its edges frayed but intact. Clara, he said, his voice low, calm, a thread of control he clung to. She paused, the needles stilling, but her eyes stayed on the yarn. What do you want, Henry? She asked, her tone flat, a wall he recognized from their last encounter. He shifted his weight, hands clasped behind his back, a habit from years of facing down adversaries, but this was no negotiation. I came to see you, he said simply. And the boy. Her gaze flicked up then, sharp and searching, as if testing the weight of his words. You saw us yesterday, she replied, resuming her knitting. Nothing's changed. The dismissal hung heavy, but Henry didn't retreat. He pulled a folding chair closer and sat, the metal creaking under his frame, a deliberate choice, to stay despite her resistance. I read Emily's letter, he said, his voice steady, though the ache in his chest pulsed with every word. She wrote to me 5 years ago. I didn't know. Clara's hands faltered, just for a moment, the needles catching on a stitch. She recovered quickly, her face a mask of composure, but Henry saw the flicker, pain, perhaps, or the ghost, of a wound reopened. She wrote a lot of things, Clara said, her tone measured. Letters, journals. She was good with words. Better than me. She glanced at the baby, her expression softening. She wanted to know you, Henry. Always. Asked about her father. I told her you were busy, building things, saving the world. It was easier than the truth. The truth. It landed like a stone in his gut, but he kept his posture straight, his hands still. What was the truth? He asked, though he feared the answer. Clara's eyes met his, unflinching. That you didn't want us, she said, her voice quiet but firm, a blade wrapped in years of resilience. That you chose your empire over your family. I didn't want her to hate you, so I let her imagine something better. Henry's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. The image of Emily, chestnut hair, bright smile, a life he'd never touched, flashed through his mind. Her letter a silent accusation he couldn't dismiss. I didn't know she existed, he said, his tone even, a plea masked as fact. If I had. He stopped, the words hollow. What would he have done? Left the boardroom? Defied Richard and the partners? He wasn't sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, a crack in the dignity he'd once worn like a crown. Clara set the knitting down, the unfinished sweater resting in her lap. You didn't ask, she said, her gaze piercing. You walked. Away, Henry. I was pregnant when you signed those papers. I tried to tell you, called, wrote, but your people shut me out. After a while I stopped trying. Emily deserved more than begging for your attention. The room seemed to shrink, the stove's heat pressing against his skin. He saw it now, the calls he'd ignored, the letters he'd never opened, all filtered through assistants trained to guard his time. He'd built that wall himself, brick by brick, and Emily had paid the price. I'm here now, he said, his voice firm, a lifeline he threw into the void. I can give you a better life, both of you. My home, my resources. You don't have to stay here. Clara's lips curved, a faint bitter smile. Your home? She echoed, her tone sharp but controlled. That mansion in the Hamptons? The one with more rooms than people? We're not decorations, Henry, to fill your empty spaces. She picked up the needles again, her hands moving with purpose. This is our life. It's not perfect, but it's ours. You don't get to buy it back with your money. The rejection stung, a quiet force that tested his restraint, but he didn't rise, didn't argue. He sat there watching her knit, the sweater taking shape stitch by stitch. It's not about money, he said finally, his voice softer, a crack in his composure he couldn't hide. It's about doing what's right, for Emily's son, for you. Clara didn't respond right away. She finished a row, her fingers steady, then set the needles aside and stood, lifting the baby from the crib. He stirred, a soft whimper escaping, and she rocked him gently, her back to Henry. Doing what's right doesn't come with a price tag, she said, her voice low, final. It comes with time, Henry. Time you didn't give her. Time you can't give back. She walked away then, disappearing into a back room, the baby cradled against her shoulder. Henry remained seated, the chair cold beneath him, Clara's words echoing in the silence. He thought of the sweater in his drawer at home, blue, like the one she was knitting, a relic of a life he'd abandoned. He rose, slow and deliberate, and left the shelter, the snow swallowing his footsteps as he went. In his pocket, Emily's letter pressed against his chest, a whisper of a chance he hadn't yet earned. But he would. Somehow, he would. Henry Caldwell stepped into the sleek boardroom of Caldwell Enterprises, the Manhattan skyline a gray blur through floor-to-ceiling windows. Snow clung to the glass, softening the edges of a city that thrived on sharpness, but inside, the air crackled with tension. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights, flanked by a dozen suits, men and women who'd built their fortunes on his vision. Today, though, their eyes were cold, their whispers a low hum that stopped as he took his seat at the head. He adjusted his tie, a crisp knot of silk, and kept his face impassive, a mask honed over decades of command. Clara's words still echoed in his mind. Time you can't give back, but he buried them deep. This was his arena, and he wouldn't falter. Marissa slid a tablet across the table, her voice clipped. The PR shoot at the shelter's trending, sir. Mostly positive. Tycoon turns philanthropist. But there's chatter, rumors. Henry glanced at the screen, headlines about his mysterious visit, photos of him staring at Clara, speculation about a hidden past. He nodded, curt, and handed it back. Handle it, he said, his tone steady, though his pulse quickened. He'd expected scrutiny. Image was currency in his world, but not this fast, not this personal. Before Marissa could respond, the door swung open, and Lawrence Pierce strode in, uninvited. 55, lean as a blade, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Lawrence was a rival who'd never forgiven Henry for outbidding him on a lucrative gas contract a decade ago. He carried a rolled-up magazine, its cover flashing Henry's face from the gala, and tossed it onto the table with a thud. Well, well, Lawrence drawled, his voice smooth as venom. The great Henry Caldwell, slumming it in Brooklyn. What's the angle, old friend? Charity? Or something juicier? The board shifted, eyes darting between them. Henry leaned back, hands resting lightly on the armrests, his posture a study in control. I don't recall inviting you, Lawrence, he said, his tone even, a quiet warning. Lawrence smirked, pacing the room like a predator circling prey. Oh, I invited myself. See, I heard a story. Your story, Henry. A little bird told me. You've got family down there. A daughter, maybe? One you didn't bother to claim until she was cold in the ground. The room stilled, a collective intake of breath. Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise, didn't snap. Emily's name in Lawrence's mouth felt like a violation, but he kept his voice steady, his eyes locked on his rival. You're fishing, he said. Calm, deliberate. If you've got something to say it. Lawrence stopped pacing, leaning forward, his hands braced on the table. I met her, you know. Emily. Years back, when she came sniffing around my firm for a job. Social worker, bleeding heart, desperate to feed herself. I turned her away. Figured she wasn't worth the time. Funny thing is, she mentioned you. Said her dad was a big shot. I didn't believe her then. Should have known you'd leave your own kid to rot. The words landed like a fist, each one a calculated strike at Henry's dignity, but he didn't flinch. His hands gripped the chair, knuckles whitening, yet his face remained a mask, calm, unyielding. Inside, though, a storm raged. Emily, his daughter, reaching out to this man, this snake, while he'd sat in this very room, oblivious. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice low, a steel thread running through it. Lawrence laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Don't I? The press'll love this. Billionaire abandons dying daughter. I've already tipped them off. By tomorrow you'll be a headline, Henry, and not the kind you frame. The board erupted, voices overlapping, anger, concern, calculation. Is this true? Demanded Evelyn Carter, a silver-haired director with a stare like ice. Henry, we can't have a scandal now, not with the merger on the table. Others chimed in, a chorus of doubt, but Henry raised a hand, silencing them. Enough, he said, his tone firm, final. "Lawrence, you've had your fun. Get out." Lawrence straightened, smirking. "Oh, I'm going, but this?" He tapped the magazine. "This is just the start." He sauntered out, leaving a wake of unease. Henry turned to the board, his gaze steady despite the chaos in his chest. "There's no scandal," he said, each word deliberate. "I've been to the shelter. I'm helping where I can. That's all you need to know." Evelyn leaned forward, unconvinced. "Helping who? This woman? Clara? The child? Henry, if there's truth here, it could tank us. The shareholders won't stand for it." He met her eyes, unflinching. "I'll handle it. The merger goes forward. You have my word." They dispersed, grumbling, but Henry stayed, the room emptying around him. Alone, he pressed a hand to his forehead, the first crack in his composure since Lawrence's ambush. Emily's face, her smile from the photos, flashed in his mind, and now Lawrence's sneer overlaid it. He'd failed her, yes, but he wouldn't fail her son. Not again. That night he called Marissa. "Set up a fund," he said, his voice clipped. "Anonymous. For the shelter. Food, clothes, whatever they need." She hesitated. "Sir, with the press, do it," he cut in, firm. "No questions." 2 days later, a delivery arrived at the shelter. Crates of supplies, no sender listed. Henry watched from his car across the street, the snow falling in heavy sheets. Clara emerged, inspecting the goods, her expression unreadable. Then she turned, her eyes finding his through the storm, and shook her head. She went back inside, leaving the crates untouched. A note arrived at his office later, her handwriting stark. "I don't need your generosity, Henry. I need you to understand." He read it, his chest tightening, but he didn't crumple it, didn't throw it away. He folded it neatly, slipping it into his pocket beside Emily's letter. Back in the boardroom, the phone rang. Evelyn, her voice terse. "The story's out. Caldwell's secret family. They're calling for your head, Henry. Fix this, or we will." He hung up, staring at the snow beyond the glass. Lawrence's taunts and Clara's rejection, a twin assault on his honor. But he didn't shout, didn't rage. He sat, hands clasped, and let the storm settle inside him. Dignity, he thought, wasn't in fighting back, it was in standing firm. And he would for Clara, for the boy, for the daughter he'd never known. Henry Caldwell drove north from Manhattan, the city's lights fading into a blur of snow and shadow. The Hudson River stretched beside him, its surface a dark mirror under the winter sky, flecked with ice that caught the faint glow of distant street lamps. He'd left the boardroom behind, its threats, its demands, carrying only Clara's note and Emily's letter in his pocket, twin weights against his chest. The press had erupted that morning, headlines screaming, "Caldwell's secret shame" across every screen and newsstand. Lawrence Pierce's venom seeping into the public eye. But Henry didn't turn on the radio, didn't check his phone. He needed silence, and he needed answers. Paul, the investigator, had called earlier with a location. Emily's ashes had been scattered along a quiet stretch of the Hudson, a spot she'd loved as a child, according to Clara's sparse records. Henry pulled off the road, the SUV's tires crunching on frozen gravel, and stepped into the cold. The wind bit at his face, tugging at his overcoat, but he walked to the riverbank, his polished shoes sinking into the snow. The water moved slow and steady, a timeless flow that mocked his urgency. He stood there, hands in his pockets, and let the stillness settle over him. A man who'd mastered chaos, now seeking something he couldn't control. From his coat, he pulled Emily's letter, unfolding it with care. Her handwriting trembled on the page, young and earnest. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm your daughter. I don't want money or anything. I just thought you should know I exist. I work at a shelter in Queens. Maybe you'll see me there someday. Emily." He'd read it a dozen times since Paul handed it to him, but now, standing where she'd last been, the words carved deeper. She'd wanted him to know her, not his wealth, not his name, just him. And he'd failed her not through malice, but through the quiet apathy of a life built on ambition. "Mr. Caldwell?" A voice broke the silence, soft but firm. Henry turned, startled, to see a woman approaching, 50-ish, bundled in a quilted coat, her gray hair peeking from a wool cap. She carried a thermos, steam curling from its lid, and her eyes held a quiet recognition. "I thought it might be you," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I saw the news, figured you'd come here eventually." He straightened, his posture instinctive, a shield of composure. "Do I know you?" he asked, his tone calm, though his pulse quickened. She shook her head, offering a faint smile. "No, I knew Emily. I'm Ruth. Worked with her at the Queen's shelter. She talked about this place, said it was where she felt closest to something bigger. I come here sometimes to remember her." Henry nodded, slow, processing. "You knew my daughter," he said, the word daughter still foreign, heavy on his tongue. Ruth's smile faded, her gaze softening. "Yeah, she was special, tough, kind, the kind of person who'd give you her last dollar and make you feel good about taking it. She talked about you sometimes. Not with anger, though. More like curiosity." The wind carried her words, and Henry felt them settle into the cracks of his resolve. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice steady, though his hands tightened around the letter. Ruth poured coffee from the thermos into a tin cup, handing it to him. "She said you were a big man, someone who built things. She wondered what you were like, whether you'd be proud of her maybe. She never hated you, even when she should have." He took the cup, its warmth seeping into his cold fingers, but didn't drink. "I didn't know her," he said, the admission raw, unguarded. "I didn't know she existed until—" He stopped, the weight of it too much to finish. Ruth nodded, understanding. She knew that. Clara told her you'd moved on. But Emily, she had this hope, you know. She came to one of your events once, a charity thing you hosted in Midtown. Henry's breath caught, a sudden jolt in the stillness. "She what?" Ruth sipped her own coffee, her eyes distant. "About 4 years ago. She just started. At the shelter, wanted to see you up close. She knitted a little sweater, blue, tiny for a kid, and left it at your table with a note. For my dad, it said. She didn't stay, too scared you'd turn her away. I don't know if you ever—" Got it. The world tilted. Henry's mind raced back. 4 years, a gala at the plaza, tables strewn with donations and cards. He remembered a sweater, small and soft, handed to him by an assistant with a shrug. Some kid left this. He'd tucked it into a drawer at home, dismissing it as a quirk, a trifle. Now the memory burned, a twist of fate that left him reeling. Emily had been there, steps away, reaching out in her quiet way, and he'd walked past her, blind. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking the first crack in his restraint. Ruth watched him, her gaze steady. "She didn't blame you. She just wanted you to have something of hers." Henry turned back to the river, the letter trembling in his hand, tears stinging his eyes, tears he hadn't shed in decades. They fell, silent into the snow, and he let them, a release he couldn't fight. He drove to the shelter hours later, the night deep and starless. Clara was there, rocking the baby by the stove, her face etched with fatigue. Henry approached, his steps deliberate, and knelt beside her, a man who'd never knelt for anyone. "Clara," he said, his voice low, firm despite the tremor inside. "I didn't know about Emily, about the sweater, the letter, any of it. I'm here now. I'm asking you to let me protect him." He nodded to the boy, his grandson sleeping in her arms. Clara's eyes met his, searching, weighing. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching taut. Then, softly, she spoke. "Protecting him isn't a promise you make to me, Henry. It's one you keep to him." Her voice wavered, but her gaze held firm, a challenge and a plea entwined. Henry nodded, slow, resolute. "I will," he said, the words a vow, etched into the cold night air. He rose, his dignity intact, but changed, forged anew by a river's edge and a daughter's unseen gift. Henry Caldwell lingered at the Brooklyn shelter the next day, the snow outside piling higher, a white shroud over the city's clamor. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of soup simmering on a hot plate, the murmur of voices a steady hum. He sat near Clara, not at her table but close enough to watch her rock the baby, his grandson, in a slow, soothing rhythm. The boy's tiny hand gripped her finger, and Henry felt a pang, sharp and unfamiliar, at the sight. He'd come with no agenda today, no gifts to offer, just a quiet resolve born by the Hudson's edge. Emily's sweater, her unseen gesture, had shifted something in him, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. He rose, hesitant, and approached the crib. "May I?" he asked, his voice low, steady. Clara glanced up, her eyes wary but softening at the edges. She nodded, a silent permission, and stepped back. Henry leaned over, his hands that had signed empires into being, trembling as he lifted the boy. The weight was slight, fragile, a life he hadn't earned the right to hold. The baby stirred, eyes blinking open, and Henry froze, unsure. Then, awkwardly, he adjusted his grip, mimicking Clara's hold, and the boy settled, a soft gurgle escaping. Clara watched, her expression unreadable, but she didn't intervene. "His name's Daniel," she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact, a bridge offered without fanfare. Henry nodded, testing the name in his mind, Daniel, and felt a flicker of something like peace. "Daniel," he repeated, soft, a vow in the word. He sat again cradling the boy, and for a moment, the shelter's chaos faded. It was just them, him, Clara, Daniel, a tableau of what might have been. The reprieve shattered when his phone buzzed, insistent. Marissa's voice crackled through, urgent. "Sir, it's bad. The board's called an emergency meeting. Pierce's article hit, Caldwell's neglect kills daughter. They're demanding your resignation now." Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept his hold on Daniel steady, his voice calm. "I'll be there in an hour." He hung up, meeting Clara's gaze. "Trouble?" she asked, her tone dry. "Always," he replied, a faint rueful smile tugging at his lips. He handed Daniel back, careful, deliberate, and stood. "I'll return," he said, a promise, not a plea. The boardroom at Caldwell Enterprises was a battlefield when he arrived. Snow streaked the windows, a muted roar against the storm inside. The directors sat rigid, their faces a gallery of judgment. Evelyn, Carter at the forefront, her silver hair glinting like a blade. Lawrence Pierce stood by the door, uninvited but triumphant, his smirk a silent taunt. On the table, newspapers and tablets blared the story. Billionaire's secret child dies in poverty. Henry took his seat, hands clasped, his posture a fortress of composure. He'd faced down crises before, hostile takeovers, market crashes. But this was personal, a strike at the dignity he was only beginning to reclaim. "Henry," Evelyn began, her voice icy, "this is a disaster. The merger's at risk, shareholders are panicking, and Pierce here claims you've hidden a family to dodge responsibility. Explain yourself." The room leaned in, hungry for weakness, but Henry met her gaze, unflinching. "There's no explanation owed," he said, his tone even, a steel thread running through it. "The story's half true. I had a daughter, Emily. I didn't know her. She died 6 months ago. Her son's with my ex-wife, Clara. That's the truth. The rest is noise." Lawrence laughed, a harsh bark. "Noise? You abandoned them, Henry. I've got witnesses, shelter workers, Emily's old boss. They'll bury you. Step down or I'll make sure the world knows what a fraud you are." The board murmured, tension spiking, but Henry didn't rise, didn't snap. His hands tightened on the chair, knuckles white, yet his face remained calm, a mask of restraint. "You've made your point, Lawrence," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "Now sit down or get out." Evelyn cut in, sharp. "This isn't a game, Henry. We need stability. Resign or we vote you out." The ultimatum hung heavy, a noose tightening around his legacy. Henry leaned forward, his eyes sweeping the room, steady, unyielding. "You want stability?" he said, his tone firm, final. "Then listen. I've spent 20 years building this company. Every deal, every dollar, but I've spent longer running from something else. My family. I didn't know Emily, and I'll carry that. But I know her son now, and I won't run again." He stood, slow, deliberate, and faced them all. "I'm stepping down," he said, the words a quiet thunder. "Not because of your threats or Pierce's lies, but because it's right. My title doesn't define me anymore. My actions will. The merger's yours. The company's yours. I'm done." The room erupted, gasps, protests, but Henry turned, walking past Lawrence without a glance, his dignity intact, forged anew. Back at the shelter, night had fallen, the snow a relentless curtain. Clara sat by the stove, Daniel asleep in her arms. She looked up as Henry entered, his suit rumpled, his face etched with fatigue but calm. "You're back," she said, surprise threading her voice. He nodded, kneeling beside her. "I told you I would be." She studied him, then reached into a bag beside her, pulling out a small blue sweater, Emily's, the one she'd left. "At the gala." "Found this in her things," Clara said, her voice soft. "She'd want you to have it." Henry took it, his fingers tracing the stitches, tears pricking his eyes. Not of shame, but of something deeper. A release. "She'd want me to earn it," he said, his voice steady despite the ache. "And I will. For her. For Daniel." Clara's hand rested on his shoulder, brief, tentative, a bridge not fully crossed but begun. He held the sweater close, the shelter's warmth wrapping around them, a light piercing the dark he'd lived in too long. For the first time, Henry felt not the weight of loss, but the promise of what could be reclaimed. The snow fell lighter now, a gentle drift over the small house Henry Caldwell had rented on the outskirts of Brooklyn. It was a far cry from the Hamptons estate, 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, windows that rattled in the wind. But it felt alive in a way his mansion never had. Inside, a single lamp glowed on the kitchen table, casting a warm circle of light across the worn wood. Henry sat there, his broad hands fumbling with a pair of knitting needles, the blue yarn tangling more than it looped. He muttered under his breath, a faint curse swallowed by a chuckle, and tried again. Clara had taught him the basics that afternoon, her voice patient but firm. "Slow down, Henry. It's not a contract you can force." She sat across from him now, cradling Daniel, the baby's soft breaths a steady rhythm in the quiet. Her silver-streaked hair caught the lamplight, and her eyes, still sharp, still steady, watched him with a mix of amusement and something softer, something new. 2 weeks had passed since he'd walked away from Caldwell Enterprises, since he'd knelt in the shelter and promised to earn the sweater Emily had left him. The press had roared for days, tycoons fall from grace. But Henry hadn't, fought back, hadn't explained. He'd sold the penthouse, liquidated stocks, and moved here, steps from the shelter, steps from Clara and Daniel. The board had their merger, Lawrence his petty victory. Henry had something else, a chance. "You're terrible at this," Clara said, her tone dry but warm, a tease that felt like a gift. Henry glanced up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I've negotiated with oil barons," he replied, his voice steady, playful. "This shouldn't be harder." She laughed, a small, genuine sound that echoed in his chest, and adjusted Daniel in her arms. "Emily was better," she said, softer now. She'd finish one of these in a night, said it kept her hands busy and her mind still. Henry nodded, setting the needles down, the half-formed sweater a mess of knots. He reached for the one Emily had made, the blue relic from the gala, folded neatly beside him. His fingers traced its stitches, perfect and small, a legacy of a daughter he'd never known but felt closer to every day. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice low, a request, not a demand. Clara's gaze drifted to the lamp, her expression distant, tender. "She was stubborn," she began. "Like you, I suppose. Loved helping people, kids especially. She'd bring home strays, human or otherwise, and fix them up. Said it was her way of making the world less cold. The words painted Emily in his mind. Chestnut hair, bright eyes, a smile that lit rooms. And Henry let them settle, a quiet ache mingling with pride. She got that from you, he said, meeting Clara's eyes. The strength, the care. Clara's lips pressed together, a flicker of surprise, then softened. Maybe, she conceded, but she had your fire too. She never gave up, even when the cancer came. Fought to the end. For Daniel. Daniel stirred, a soft whimper, and Clara rocked him gently, humming a tune Henry didn't recognize but felt in his bones. He watched, the lamplight framing them, and saw what he'd missed for 20 years. A family, not perfect, not whole, but real. I'm sorry, he said, the words slipping out, raw but calm. For not being there, for her, for you. Clara's humming stopped, her gaze locking with his. I know, she said, simple, final. You're here now. That's what matters. The next morning, Henry walked to the shelter, his breath visible in the crisp air. He'd started volunteering, sorting donations, serving soup. His hands, clumsy but willing. The regulars nodded at him now, a quiet acceptance, and he felt the shift. Not a tycoon, not a savior, just a man doing the work. Clara joined him later, Daniel in a sling against her chest, and they moved in tandem, a rhythm building between them. When a crate of blankets arrived, unmarked, generous, Clara raised an eyebrow. You? She asked. Henry shook his head. Not this time. Someone else, maybe. She smiled, faint, approving, and handed him a ladle. Keep stirring, she said. You're learning. That evening, back at the house, Henry sat with a notepad, his handwriting sharp against the page. He'd cashed out a chunk of his fortune, enough to live simply, and drafted a plan. A fund for the shelter, named for Emily, to support single mothers and their kids. No fanfare, no press, just a quiet act of repair. He showed it to Clara, his voice steady as he explained. It's not about me, he said. It's about her, what she stood for. Clara read it, her fingers brushing the paper, and nodded. She'd like that, she said, her voice thick. She'd like you too, I think. The lamp flickered, a brief stutter, and Henry stood to adjust it, his shadow stretching across the room. He looked at Clara, at Daniel, and felt the weight of his old life lift, boardrooms, titles, the hollow chase, replaced by something solid, something earned. I've found myself here, he said, his tone firm, a truth he'd fought to claim. Clara reached across the table, her hand resting on his, warm and sure. And us, she replied, soft but certain. Late, but not too late. Outside, the snow slowed, flakes catching the lamplight through the window, a dance of light against the dark. Henry picked up the needles again, fumbling but persistent, and Clara guided his hands, her touch a silent pact. Daniel cooed, a small sound that filled the space, and Henry smiled, genuine, unguarded, for the first time in years. The house wasn't grand, the life not glamorous, but it was his, theirs, a redemption stitched together day by day. In the quiet, Henry thought of Emily, her sweater, her hope, and knew she'd seen this somehow in her dreams of a father she'd never met. He'd failed her once, but not again. The lamp glowed steady now, its light spilling beyond the table out into the night, a beacon beneath the snow. And beneath it, Henry Caldwell sat, not a tycoon, not a ghost, but a man. Flawed, resolute, home. And as the snow settled outside, the lamp's gentle glow wrapped the room in warmth. A light not just for one man, but for a family pieced back together through quiet courage and unshaken dignity. He'd traded a throne of power for a seat at this humble table, proving that true honor isn't in what you rule, but in what you mend. This journey's end isn't just a farewell, it's a beginning, a testament to love reclaimed against all odds, Did this story touch your soul? Want more tales of resilience and redemption? Then smash that like button, hit subscribe, and join us for the next chapter. Because every story deserves a voice, and we'd love for you to be part of ours!